Hello to everyone, and thanks for joining this particular session. As you'll see, it was entitled Fossil Fuel Workers and Climate Jobs, and the intention is that I would sort of chair or facilitate this session. My name, to those that don't know, I'm Chris Boff. I'm a trade union activist, former national officer in the UK Civil Service Union, PCS, and I was also one of the co-founders of the 1 million climate jobs in 2009. Now, the purpose of the session, in many ways, reflecting, I think, many of the sessions that we've framed and organised, is how do we engage fossil fuel workers in a conversation about climate change, but how do we translate that conversation into plans of action, climate jobs, alternatives. And that's really, if you like, the gist of this particular session. As I said, each speaker will get 10 minutes, have a general discussion, and then a summing up. We're only going to be recording the speakers, but if there's any questions or thoughts that you want to raise after the speakers have spoken, either put your hand up, or you can raise it through chat, or you can just literally just put your hand up, and hopefully I'll notice you. So I'll shut up at this point and invite, first of all, Neil Rothnie. Really pleased that Neil was able to come and speak. Works in the oil industry for 40 years. A founder member of the Oil Industry Liaison Committee, a long-standing trade unionist, and also a climate activist involved with Scotty 3 and Extinction Rebellion. So thanks for agreeing to speak, Neil, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks everybody for giving me the opportunity to come here and speak. You know, you've outlined my history, I suppose, and it's really because I've 40 years in the history that I'm here. I don't have very much more of interest to tell anyone other than what actually went on during these 40 years, but that's crucially important. I mean, at the beginning, though, we need to stress that, you know, circumstances today are hugely different, completely different from the period under which I made my experiences in the oil industry. I mean, I don't need to spell out anything, but you know, if you don't start from the fact that we're in a major global warming crisis with major climate implications, then it would, if all the rest would be sort of pointless. And that's the sea in which we're all swimming. And the other, you know, the other aspect which needs to be brought in at the top of this, and not that I've got any expert or any special insight into these things, but it is the cost of living crisis. I mean, it's galloping, and it's going to involve us all, and it's a huge challenge. And you'll notice that in both of these categories, crisis looms very, very looms, doesn't it? It just looms. Anyway, yeah, my first consideration, I suppose, is just transition. I mean, it's the buzz. It's how we've always looked at the issue of oil workers, fossil fuel workers, you call them. I call them North Sea oil and gas workers. It removes it from being, you know, a sort of concept to an actual reality. North Sea oil and gas workers, a just transition. You know, the first thing would be that they're not binary, you know, just and transition are not binary opposites, but they're not equals either. I mean, first comes transition, because without transition, you have absolutely no future and no justice. The justice which offshore oil workers can expect is the same justice that we're all going to get. The justice that their children will get is the justice that our children will get. First comes transition, and they are going to have to engage in the transition. But it's like the rest of us, they're going to be dragged screaming. I spent 40 years in the oil industry without any real understanding of global climate change. Had I heard the terms? Yes, of course I had heard the terms. I just didn't see, despite the fact that I was in the industry that was producing the product that was driving the crisis, I didn't see that, didn't see it at all. But I wasn't alone. Chris introduced himself as a trade union official, and I suppose I should go back to my experience, my history, my story. It's easier that way, anyway. I mean, yes, I'm a committed trade unionist. You know, I belong to Industry Energy, a Norwegian trade union. I spent half of my career, oh, there you go, I've said it, half of my working life in the North Sea on the Norwegian sector. Well, you know, the Norwegian sector and the British sector, it's exactly the same water, and it's exactly the same oil, and exactly the same gas, but with slightly different, with slightly different trajectories. My first experiences, of course, were in the British sector of the North Sea. And the very, very first thing that I confronted on the North Sea was the dysfunctional nature of the trade union movement. It just did not begin to organise on the North Sea when I was there. This is early days, of course. 1972, I think, is when I first went offshore. But in joining the Transport and General Workers Union and attempting to organise in the rig, I immediately confronted the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy had already obviously been speaking to the oil industry employers. You know, the money was already flowing, and it was almost impossible to, I mean, there's no point in generalizing, you know, trying to organize on an oil rig, we worked 2 weeks on, 1 week off. That's 16 days on the rig, 15 days on the rig, sorry, and 6 days off. The guys were not going to go to the union during their time off. So yeah, I did it. I took the dues, went to the union, tried to pay the dues, tried to organize the guys, and that was shut down within about 10 minutes. No, the union bureaucratic rules do not allow you to do that. You cannot have that. You need to get yourself elected as a dues collector or as a representative in the rig. And this was nigh impossible for a youngster in the industry at that time. Anyway, look, the initial history of the North Sea was one, as I said, trade union dysfunction. The trade unions fought over the old demarcations. You had at that time, when I first started, it was a very, very non-organized workforce in the sense that they wanted anybody apart from anyone with a history in the blue collar trade union sector. They didn't want guys who'd come out of coal mines or car factories or even engineering shops. They did not. They wanted bakers and butchers and candlestick makers and teachers and anybody without an industrial history. This came straight from the deep south. The rigs came from America. The guys who trained us came from America. The fear of trade union organization was palpable. And of course, the training they'd had was in the deep south, and the racism was unbelievable. But the response was very, very muted, as I pointed out with that story about the T&G. On the other hand, in the next couple of years, they were forced to bring in thousands and thousands of highly skilled industrial workers who had worked in the power stations, worked in the dams, worked in the major engineering projects in the UK. They came out to do the hookups. They came out to build the platforms. And at this point, the dysfunction of the trade unions became very, very clear. You had 7 or 8, I think 7 major trade unions, all still in competitive mode, full competitive mode. We had a thing called oh God, I can't remember, but the Inter-Union Offshore Oil Committee, which did not function. You had no centralized organization in the North Sea, just a collection of squabbling workers. And of course, the North Sea at that time was Klondike. I mean, Armand Hammer of Piper Alpha fame went on the rig and famously could feel the oil, the money, he said. He could feel the money coursing through the platform underneath his feet. Of course, what he could feel was a platform just about to blow up. just about to destroy the 167 guys that it did destroy. And of course, at that point, when the shock, I mean, everybody went into utter shock. Personally, I think I was probably mentally ill for a whole period then and for a whole period afterwards. And I wasn't alone. All our hopes and all our fears were realised. All our fears were absolutely realised.
Sorry to interrupt, Neil. 2 minutes to go.
Oh, God. And I haven't even started. I suppose, generalise at this point. You're beginning to get the idea. The trade unions have not only been utterly incompetent. When we built our independent trade union, it was captured. That trade union failed miserably to organise in the North Sea. Today, the North Sea, the oil industry workforce is still very unorganised. The numbers are very, very low. The agreements that they have are sweetheart agreements. They are still sweetheart agreements which benefit the employers. Now, this is the conditions under which we're going to have to work with reality. The oil workers will be involved. But if you go into this with some sort of illusion about the traditional trade unions doing the traditional things and somehow leading the transition, then I think we're all in for a very big shock. It's not all doom and gloom. Look, the oil workers are also part of their communities. Now, the communities are now under massive attack from the very same enemy that the climate justice movement has identified. It's North Sea gas. It's piped into their homes, the homes of their mother, the homes of their relatives, the homes of their friends. It's the communities, including the oil workers' communities, are now going to find out the enemy, and it's North Sea gas and North Sea gas profiteering. And it's on that level that I think that we have an opportunity to speak to oil workers. It's certainly not through the traditional channels. I had so many other things to say, but of course now I've kind of wound it to the point where I have very little. Look, we don't know the history. We know the history of the North Sea. We don't know the future. We don't know the future of the climate crisis. We don't know the future of the cost of living crisis, but we know that they intersect, and that the climate justice movement, more than, I'm introducing a binary opposite here, I suppose. I mean, if you had to put your confidence in your faith and who's going to show leadership on the North Sea with workers, it would have to be in the climate justice movement. And you would have to approach the trade union bureaucracy with extreme caution. Extreme caution. Well, anyway, I'd better stop now.
Well, thanks very much, Neil. I mean, that was I know it's difficult in 10 minutes to convey what you want to say, but that was a really fascinating intro to the history of organising in the North Sea. And you pose the big questions that we need to be trying to answer. So thanks again, Neil. And I'll just move on to Vivian, if you're okay to speak now. I think you're still on mute.
Right. Thank you. I'm sharing my screen. I just want to say thank you so much, Neil. Starting off with someone with a 40-year career in the oil industry, has a clear eye about some of the challenges we face, both in terms of the trade union movement, the climate crisis, and the crisis of inflation. There's a few other crises that we're facing, and depending where you sit. But I thank you for starting off that way. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to be speaking about mobilizing workers and building coalitions for a just transition. A little bit about what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to position myself, talk about how labor is developing, or, how is labor developing real programs for workers in the face of climate change. What immediate steps I would say need to be taken in terms of raising consciousness and building solidarity for just transitions and how we move forward in the long view. So I'm doing this with some different kinds of experiences under my belt. I've been an activist for many years. I've worked in industrial and construction areas as electrical maintenance. I worked in the auto industry, steel. I've been a union leader, and I've more recently been a professor, a filmmaker, an international researcher, and an advocate for just transitions. And I want to also point out that as you said, Neil, I think the situation in the United States, and I'm speaking primarily of the United States today, is that there's a few jobs that pay living wages. And even those jobs, people work extraordinarily long hours and make enormous sacrifices, rotating shifts and long days. And the oil industry is one of those. And only the portion of the oil industry that's unionized. So it is extremely difficult to see a transition away from good jobs. Another important sector is the building trades. And these two areas, the building trades and what's left of the unionized industrial landscape, are two areas that also are enormously based in the fossil fuel industry. So they comprise a great deal of the power within the trade union movement. So I'll move to how is labor developing real programs for workers in the face of climate change? And I speak now as somebody who's been active in a number of these struggles, or who's been an observer or a researcher. So I kind of divided this into three: coalition and program building that's across labor and environmental justice and environmentalists and indigenous groups. So one really interesting model was the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy. And that was, they devised Proposition 1631 in the state of Washington. It was a multi-year effort that brought together anti-poverty and environmental justice groups, environmentalists, and indigenous groups to build a democratic model that had an excellent program for workers, for community investment, and put all of the partners in the driver's seat in terms of dispersing the fund that would be paid for by the polluters with a carbon fee. And it's a model that really needs to be discussed. It did not pass. It was an initiative in which at the end of its very popular run for election was defeated by the oil industry, who dumped $30 million in at the end of the towards the election date. Another example is the Labor Network for Sustainability Convergence. LNS is a national group that brings all of these partners together for various different kinds of campaigns. One of those was around COVID, very successfully bringing environmentalists in to support workers who desperately needed PPE and support during the pandemic. A local event that happened in the Northern California region, Labor Climate Convergence. This is a large image of it, and there's this is actually a hot link. If we ever share these, if you look on YouTube, there's a 3-hour video of a wonderful convergence that took place online that brought all of the people together, not indigenous groups, but otherwise, and had some dialogue around the issues that face all of these different coalition partners. And Jobs to Move America is another example that brings many of these disparate groups together. And I think that it's very important to think about how coalitions are what's required to build climate justice. Then our second category is climate legislation and labor caucuses and coalitions. So within the United States, on the federal level, it's been very difficult to organize, but on the state level, there's been some successful caucuses. In Colorado, there was the Office of Just Transition that came out of a environmentalist and labor action that included some environmental justice groups, but primarily labor. The Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, followed by Maine and Rhode Island, again, carving out areas of the building trades and in some cases, the teachers' unions cooperated to create jobs that preserved good labor conditions. The New York Climate Bill, a similar kind of situation where decarbonization was also accompanied by good labor standards. Labor Leading the Climate and Trade Unions for Energy Democracy are both well-known organizations, one national, TUED is international, that bring labor unions together to talk about just transition, to find ways towards climate justice. And then finally, support for local struggles. So we had a large and long Chevron strike in Richmond, California, where environmentalists, environmental justice communities came together to support workers that they knew were dealing with horrible conditions and would eventually face a transition away from fossil fuel jobs. And then
sorry to interrupt, Vivian, just to let you know, 8 minutes gone. You got 2 minutes left.
Great, thank you. And then the miners' strike in Alabama was another example, just of a fossil fuel industry, very dedicated workers attempting to shore up their conditions, and in which there was community support. We also have wonderful podcasts of labor and environmental justice groups coming together. So these are the kinds of ways that I see labor unions working, towards elevating the discussion. There's also grants, especially in California, that are coming forward, and unions are trying to figure out how to work together on those. One example is Steelworkers 675. I had a high road grant a few years ago to organize a electric bus assembly plant. And that similarly, the IBW and Smart Sheet Metal Workers Union also organized plants in similar ways with Jobs to Move America. So there are various trade union organizations that are working in this regard. So, but there's so much more to do, and there's so much controversy around these areas. So I wanted to highlight a few points. I think in terms of immediate steps, we need to raise consciousness and build solidarity. So I've got a lot of information here. I think we need to intensify rank and file member climate and equity education. I'm working on a project with the Canadian Building Trades Union to infuse climate literacy into the curriculum of their apprentices and journey level folks. And it's a fascinating project to see where it goes. I think we need to conduct surveys. There's a survey to the right that I've got the highlights from, asking workers, and I think Gabrielle will be talking about this, what do they think about climate change? What are their thoughts? What do they think unions should do? We need to show films, create convergences to stimulate thinking and action within labor and involve members, not just officers, in organizing around climate justice. We need to support the upsurge of labor organizing. And here's an Amazon logo. You know, there's enormous activity in the United States right now that, you know, really needs our support. We need to look internationally to learn and how members feel about and act on climate change. Examples are the Unite Environmental Reps, the clauses in collective bargaining agreements that have been collected in Canada, the anti-fracking coalitions between labor and community in the UK. We need to find models of eco-social transitions to study and build on them. And I think Washington State 1631 is a great example. And then we need to really think about building coalitions for just transition. So the reality is that climate change threatens everyone, and standing alone will not protect union members. And that means organizing dialogues and projects among all the parties, working together with educational institutions, youth, cultural organizations, Indigenous, anti-racist, anti-poverty, and feminist groups on climate change transition plans. Labor by itself cannot lift this load. And we need to make sure that we don't get bought off by divisive and secretive backroom deals, favoring the few over the many. And finally, an injury to one is an injury to all. The long view is that a small group of unions allied with fossil fuel companies should not control the labor movement. We have to fight for, we have to realize that fighting for one sector of labor against another sector weakens labor's power. Yeah. We need internal renewal and to foster union democracy and combat racial, ethnic, and gender hierarchies, homophobic, anti-trans, and classist structures from inside and towards the community. And finally, external changes. I think central labor councils and locals need active engagement with community, not just window dressing. We need real community unionism, and fostering international cooperation between labor and civil society. The Svensson Award that Norway presents is an example of international recognition of the importance of standing together, and strike support's another example. And I'll stop there.
Well, thanks very much, Vivian. You know, I mean, that is, again, a brilliant insight into the coalition building in particular. Fascinated to see what you've been doing there, and also very interesting, you know, talking about what legislation which is of interest in, you know, what demands can we place on the politicians, and also perhaps with the films, any films or links to films or podcasts, feel free to put that in the chat if you don't mind, Vivian. I'm sure we'd all be fascinated to see it. So, Gabrielle, are you okay to speak now? Yeah, over to you then.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks Neil and Vivian. That was really great. And I only have so much to add, but I'll give it a go. Yeah, so I was asked to talk about the work I do with Platform. I'm a Just Transition campaigner with Platform. I have been for 3 years, and we do a lot of work with Friends Lear Scotland and RMT OILC. So I guess it's useful to start if we're looking at like the trajectory of the work with the report called Sea Change, which we put out in 2019, that basically looked at the number of barrels of oil that the UK North Sea could produce while staying within 1.5, as well as job modeling for potential investment or renewable or like jobs in renewables based on investment levels. I think the report was really important for imagining a life in the UK beyond oil and gas, but going beyond the report, we didn't necessarily know what workers in the industry wanted or the specific just transition demands that we should be campaigning for based on their needs. And I think we kind of approached the question from understanding that obviously climate change is a consequence of economic systems that also hurt people internationally, nationally, locally, like Neil and Vivian have both already done. When you frame just transition in the broader cost of living crisis and all the other intersecting crises, we're basically in an ongoing crisis of inequality where the climate movement and the labor movement have more in common than they do in difference. But it's not necessarily always the easiest thing to find those points where you can work together. And we understood that basically it wasn't about waiting for unions to direct us, because ultimately they aren't environmental campaigners. It's our job as climate justice campaigners to be proactive about what a future looks like throughout and after the energy transition that benefits the workers and communities that currently rely on the fossil fuel industry. And so looking at campaigns that could directly, benefit the material reality for people, both internationally and locally, it also makes it easier to motivate people to engage in just transition, because it's about the control they have over their day-to-day lives and the future of their communities, which help us to build direct power against the oil and gas industry. If people are involved in building a future without fossil fuels, then they fight with you. And I think sometimes, speaking as a climate campaigner, we can get used to telling people a lot, sharing numbers or projections for the future, but building a new energy system isn't something we can really tell people. It's a process that people have to do together. And it's fundamentally an organizing challenge against some of the most powerful vested interests in the world. And basically, since Sea Change, we've worked on offshore, which was a survey of close to 1,500 offshore workers. I'll post it in the chat just now. That shed light on the industry conditions, which were quite terrible in the pandemic when we did the survey, and showed that 83% of workers were willing to transition if they had the opportunity to. We also heard from workers that training was a huge problem. Currently, the way that training standards bodies are set up in the UK means that oil and gas and wind are quite separate, and workers have to pay the price to redo their qualifications in wind. Basically, as climate campaigners, it's unacceptable for us to expect workers to pay to transition rather than the companies or the governments taking on the cost. And out of that, we built the demand for an offshore training passport, which we campaign for with Friends of the Earth Scotland, RMT, and Unite Scotland. Right now, we're working on the results of a consultation with around 40 offshore workers who spent the day with us talking about alternatives to oil and gas and what they'd need to transition. Neil actually came to one of them in Edinburgh. And we have 10 draft demands that we're testing with participants now. So Neil, you can look forward to a phone call from me where we test those results with you. But basically, it's really great because the demands that have come out of that consultation are fundamentally way more radical than you see union bureaucrats or large NGOs on the climate side talking about. Because when you get regular people who are impacted by the cost of living crisis, the context they work in, their bosses, access to energy, the future of their communities, they inevitably want things that are quite radical because they want their communities and their families to thrive in the future. And right now, we don't have those options at a policy level. And as a climate organization, I think the biggest lesson we've learned is that we have to get comfortable with being proactive around just transition. We have to take risks and build demands that appeal to workers and their unions without waiting for them to come to us with fleshed out ideas. And we also have to balance that we'll be campaigning for faster phase out dates than many in the industry would be comfortable with, but that doesn't mean that we don't have huge amounts of common ground that we can work together on. Yeah, I mean, like I said, we're all facing a cost of living crisis driven by a for-profit energy industry that exploits its workers and the environment and the public. And we don't have a government that's going to intervene. So it's our job to build alliances that focus on that common ground. We found that, I mean, what's easy is finding a way to climate conversations through the economic realities of the energy industry. And what can be hard, especially because we aren't a union, is bringing people from feeding in their opinions and their situation and their ideas to actually taking some form of action. But I mean, that's fundamentally the organizing question of any campaign or organizing initiative. It's hard to get people to feel comfortable taking big strides and taking action. But I think the consultation that we'll be releasing in early 2023 is a real opportunity to basically showcase demands that the offshore workforce backs, that other climate campaigners and other general people in society that are looking for something, for a vision from people impacted by the industry right now, to take on themselves and turn into campaigning that they can do. And I might actually leave it there in terms of speaking. I think I'm going to use the last bit of my time to show a trailer for a documentary that we released this year. It's called Offshore, and we're screening it across the UK and communities reliant on the oil and gas industry right now. The documentary is meant to prompt questions from whoever watches it about what a transition could look like in their community or workplace. And so I am going to try to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Just 1 second. Okay, view full screen. All right. Please stop me if the sound doesn't work, but let's give it a try.
This is the midnight, let no star delude us, dawn is very far. This is the tempest, long foretold, slow to make head, but sure to hold. Stand by, the lull twixt blast and blast, signals the storm is near, not past.
It's a surreal place, offshore. Like, I've been on platforms where the oil's coming up that fast from the ground that it's actually roaring.
I went to sea when I was 19 years old. It's like almost like going in a time capsule, for 3 weeks at a time.
I mean, there's 27,000 people who work offshore in Britain, but nobody knows anything about it. You're a person out there, and then when you come home, you're a different person.
He was fit, you would call a rigger, confront me. And he used to come home and his boss shoulders he's throwing.
You know, there's highs and lows, but this time it feels different to anything that's happening.
It's like a huge challenge to do it.
Trying to get workers from what is a finite industry, as oil and gas depletes, into an infinite industry.
There's certainly a sense of concern about what direction the transition might go in.
The North Sea could be the model on which we clean up the rest of the world.
It's the most vulnerable workforce in the country because they just haven't got a voice at all. You open your mouth, you get NRB'd, it's as simple as that. You get not required back.
You can call it a blacklist, call it whatever you will, but you're not going back. And everything currently is against these workers getting organised.
Most of the guys just aren't interested in making the transition. It's doubling the costs of your training. And somebody needs to look in the bit and see how enough's enough, yeah. You're having a laugh with these lads, you know.
Do you notice in life everything comes back?
I think about it all the time. It's quite scary, really.
I do worry about how it's all going to end and if it's got to be left.
We go down the route of the same thing repeating itself, and just like it did with the mining industry and the fishing industry. It'd be nice to have learned from the past.
Piper was, when you see the images of an installation destroyed, that resonated through the entire offshore population to such an extent that the grassroots resistance, if you like, began.
It doesn't have to be as bad as a lot of people maybe think it could be.
Challenge, criticism, it's your lifeblood.
I could tie them in knots because I've been there and done it. And I could advise them, but they don't want to know. They don't want to listen to it, Amanda.
spend a lot of time thinking about how it might shape up in the future. And
because this is it. This is the last game to make sure that we are a nation manufacturing and managing our natural resources for infinity.
If you start something, you've got to keep it up, haven't you?
Yeah, great. Okay, seems like it worked. But yeah, I think I should have said before, Paul and Joel, the younger man and the worker both speaking are both offshore workers, and Jake, who was the man sitting behind the desk, is a union rep. But yeah, if you want to sign up for a screening, I'll post the website for the film in the chat. And right now we're doing screenings across the UK, but in the spring, we're hoping to do a public release where hopefully it'll go out to more public audiences. So yeah, I think that's my time, but
okay. Well, thanks, Gabby. I mean, I'm pretty sure that we will all want to take you up on the offer of arranging a screening of what looks to be a fascinating little intro. Looks a marvelous film, and thank you and all of the speakers for what you've said to give concrete examples of the work and how we engage workers in this sector. So I'll just throw the discussion open.